Now, standing in the Loseley Chapel, which is attached to St Nicholas's Church, and it's called the Loseley Chapel because it contains the monuments and memorials, and indeed probably the bodies of the later Molyneux family of Loseley. And Loseley Park was, until recent times when the parish boundaries changed, part of St Nicholas's parish. Now, until 1984, the chapel and the monuments belonged to the Molyneux family, but in that year it was transferred into the ownership of St Nicholas's Church, although the family still retained responsibility for the monuments. Inside the Loseley Chapel are the memorials to the family from the 16th through to the 20th century, and also access to their vault underneath the church. We know a great deal about this family and the world they lived in because of the wonderful archive which the family built up from the early 16th century. This archive is known as the Loseley manuscripts, and it's housed partly in the Surrey History Centre in Woking and partly in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC, for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. The entrance to the chapel today is external to the church, and the floor level of the chapel is some 6 feet or so below the level of the current church. You can just glimpse the ceiling of the church through this window, an arcade of windows high on the wall. The reason for this is that the present church has been rebuilt twice since the chapel was created. Today's St Nicholas is the 3rd church on the site, built 1876-1877, but the Loseley Chapel is the only part of the medieval church still standing today. When the chapel was built in the 16th century, it was on the same level as the church, and access was through the church. The Moore family first came to Guildford in the early 16th century when Christopher Moore bought the Loseley estate. The Moores were protégés of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, and they rose to a position of significant power and influence through serving the Tudor and early Stuart monarchs. It was the Moores who enforced the Tudor Reformation in Surrey, and as a result of that work, they grew very wealthy. This is the memorial to Christopher Moore, who died in 1549, and this memorial was erected over a century after his death. This, however, is the memorial to his son, Sir William Moore, who died in 1600. He was the builder of the present Loseley House, built in 1567, where he entertained Elizabeth I at least 3 times. The memorial to Sir William was erected between 1620 and 1630 by his son George Moore, who's shown kneeling on the left-hand side. This altar tomb shows Sir William lying recumbent in splendid armour beside his wife. And as you can see, his memorial features other members of his family. His daughters are to the right, and his son and heir, George, and his wife to the left. There's also 3 blocks of text praising the worthiness, wealth, and influence of all the family. It's interesting that George Moore, who commissioned this monument, mentions everyone in the family apart from his son-in-law, who he had had thrown into prison for marrying his daughter Anne without his consent. That son-in-law was considered by George to be a worthless and useless poet. His name was John Donne. Donne's pleading letters to his father-in-law are in the Loseley manuscripts, including the poignant note, "John Donne, and Donne, undone." There's another literary connection with the Moores, for William and George owned Blackfriars in London, part of which they leased out to Richard Burbage and his company of actors and their playwright William Shakespeare. So it was in the Moores Theatre that some of Shakespeare's plays were first produced and the famous words first heard. And the Loseley Archives forms the most important archive for the history of the early theatre. Also in the Loseley Chapel is the tomb of someone who is not one of the Moore family, and that's the tomb of Arnold Brookhass, Rector of St Nicholas, who died in 1395. This is the oldest monument in Guildford, and it's very special. This tomb was originally in the north aisle of the first St Nicolas Church, but was moved into the Loseley Chapel in 1837 when the medieval church was demolished and the second St Nicolas Church built. You can just see the remains of the medieval red polychrome colouring on the priest's robes, but recent tests have shown even more. These show the remains of pink paint on his face and pure gold leaf on his collar or amice, and also right down the top edge of his red robes. Why would a rector of St Nicholas have been made to look quite so splendid? Well, Arnold Brookhass was not just the rector here. He came from a powerful family who had been in royal service for several generations. Senior royal service too. Arnold himself was Chamberlain of the Court of Exchequer to the King. He was also Clerk of the King's Works to Richard II. He oversaw building projects in palaces and cathedrals across England, and of particular note is Westminster Hall, designed and built under his supervision. On the right of the picture is the tomb of his cousin, or perhaps his half-brother. The names are confusing. That brother was Sir Bernard Brookhass, buried in Westminster Abbey. He's situated just across from Richard II. His tomb there is highly decorated, but there are many similarities with Arnold's. The metal band with the name and the date are almost identical. The vaulting above the body is more elaborate in Bernard's tomb, but there are definite similarities with Arnold's. Most notable of all are the quatrefoils underneath the body with the coats of arms, which indicate that both tombs were made in the royal workshops. Bernard Brookhass's tomb is resplendent in Westminster Abbey, but until recently, Arnold lay crumbling and flaking in a very decrepit Loseley Chapel. In 2018, the chapel and all the monuments were restored by St Nicholas's Church, and at last, Arnold Brookhass lies in a fitting environment alongside members of the Moore and Moore Molyneux family, whose estate now encompasses the lands which did at one point belong to Arnold's family. The Loseley Chapel now forms a prayerful, peaceful chapel, used not just as a mausoleum, but as a place of worship, of prayer and meditation for all St Nicholas's community.